Hello, this is Jake. This might be a somewhat disjointed video because I have a bunch of topics I want to hit on, and I'm going to forget some of them, and I don't know how well they'll come together. But I was thinking about this Grisha quote from him commentating the World Championship, where he was shocked at what he considered Caruana's bad preparation, where he was just, how would Caruana not check this early move? Like, of course you check the early moves. Your analysis should start broad and then, narrow in on the main line, but be broad. You shouldn't just narrowly go down that main line. And I think, especially as you go down in level, that's going to be truer and truer, right? If we look at like what one might consider the main line of chess, which is in the Najdorf, and let's do a quick comparison. There have been 67 million games with e4 in the online database on Lichess, and if we go to the Masters database, there's been about 1 million games with e4. So there's been 67 times more games in this database at the Lichess level, which, including all ratings, I think is a pretty good proxy for club level play. While the Master database is, of course, much higher level. And we just follow the main line of chess. So top move, e4. Now we're going to see a Sicilian, narrowly beating out e5. The Sicilian beats out e5 by more the higher the level, though at the very top level I think e5 comes back in. We're going to get an open Sicilian. We're going to get a Najdorf shortly with a6. Yep, we're in the Najdorf. Bishop g5. Bishop e3 is now played the most. If we go to the Masters database, we'll get bishop e3. We're going to go with bishop e3. Let's go with the Masters database for now. Bishop e3, e5, knight b3. White wants to advance their queenside. Black plays bishop e6 or bishop e7. The move order is slightly important, but usually transposes. White usually prefers f3 before queen d2 to avoid knight g4, but both are playable. f3, bishop e7, again, usually transpose, queen d2. Now black usually plays knight bd7 or castles. I don't know why I have so many arrows showing up. I must have pressed some button. Did that help? I don't know. Let's fix that. Best move arrow, go away. Okay. Queen d2. Black can usually chooses between knight bd7 and castles. But I think castles is a better move. Also, h5 is an interesting and good move to prevent g4. Castles also doesn't allow g4 this turn because g4 is well met by d5. And if g5, d4, and black is better. Knight bd7 takes away the queen supporting d5. So I prefer castles first, and castles is played more first. Castles, castles. Knight bd7, only now g4. b5, g5. This gets very sharp. I wrote an article about, and I think knight h5 is an interesting move, but the main move is b4, which is certainly, I think, a better move, but I do think knight h5 is a reasonable move as well. Black's main idea here is they want to displace white's knight before white displaces black and then plays knight d5, black's knight. Because if the knight moves, then it can't come to d5. If this knight moves, then white can play d5, and if it's taken, they can recapture with their queen, keeping pressure against d6 and keeping d5 available for their pieces. Well, if black has two defenders of d5 and white plays knight d5, black can take and force white to recapture pawn, which opens up this square for the bishop. Black gets strategic gains if white has to play knight d5 when black has two pieces defending it rather than one. White plays knight e2. Black plays knight e8, white plays f4, black plays a5. This is very complicated tactical stuff. I think bishop takes b3 is an interesting sideline played by the Chinese players, but the main move's a4. This knight is virtually trapped because knight a1, bishop a2 saves black's bishop, but black's bishop is also close to trapped. So white plays knight bd4. Now bishop a2 is met by knight c6, and the queen can't stay defending the bishop. Therefore, black plays ed4, white plays knight d4. This bishop's still basically trapped because bishop a2 is still met by knight c6. Very complicated stuff. b3, and now white's best defense, and really if you look over here, only good defense is king b1, with the point that ba2, king a1, and black's pawns will be cover for white's king. B takes c2, knight takes c2. Now black's bishop is still trapped. What's the best way to give it up? You might think bishop a2, but actually opening the a file is better. Now, if white's knight goes in a bad direction away from the king, black actually wins with rook a1 check, king a1, queen a5 to a2, and then checkmate on a1. Therefore, white plays knight a3. Black starts activating their pieces. They're all pretty far back, but it's sort of a coiled spring. They come forward quickly. Knight e5, h4, rook a4 hits the pawn, and bishop d4 is the main move. But let's look at this position. Rook a4 has been played 974 times in the master database. This position is reached a lot. High-level players know this theory. I always forget it, but good players remember it. And sometimes I remember it. And you've reached this position 974 times in the master database. It's 22 moves in, but it occurs a ton. Now, if we look at the online database, rook a4 has been played 39 times out of 67 million games, right? It's just a tremendous difference. If we go back to this database, it's been played almost 1,000 times. Let's just call it 1,000, and we'll say that the online database has about 1 million games in it, which means 1 out of every 1,000 master games sees this position 22 moves in, which is really deep to see a position that frequently. You won't see any other single position in chess near as frequently at the master level as you see this position. Getting any position 22 moves deep 1 out of 1,000 times is an absurdly high rate. If you look at the Lichess database, it's 40 times out of 67 million. Trying to do some mental math. That seems about 170 times less frequent, give or take. I'm sure I'm doing the math a little wrong, but approximately somewhere in that range. The lower level, the more we're going to see variance early. And Grishuk was saying, even at his tremendously high level, you got to check the early stuff. The early stuff is more important than the deep stuff. And at any level below that, that's going to be more and more true. We're going to see these deep positions reach so much less frequently the lower the level we go. So I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about it in terms of learning a new opening. And I wanted to kind of... Oh, there was another thing I was thinking about that was interesting too, that's probably not going to be connected to anything else I say. But Greg Shahade was talking at some point about teaching people to use databases and seeing if people knew how to use databases properly. Because it's easy to see what the most played move is or what the computer says. So he'd ask people, what is the main line of the Sveshnikov in some position? Is it c3 or c4? Now, I don't remember exactly which line this was, but I would guess... So the Sveshnikov is with e5 here. White plays knight b5, aiming at d6. Black plays d6 to stop them. White now tries to get control of the d5 square, which will make the d6 pawn, stay backwards and also can be a nice outpost. Black starts driving white's pieces back, threatens a fork on b4. You don't need this for now. And white can play bishop f6 and then knight d5, or knight d5 and then bishop f6. Here, knight d5 is played a lot more in the online database. What about the master database? Bishop knight d5 is played slightly more. Now, it might be interesting and will be relevant. If we look at knight d5, we have a bunch of games played, 2 games from 2015, 1 from 2000. These are the highest rated games in the position because Kasparov's rating was so absurd, and a game from 2005. So this really hasn't been seen much at the top level, at least in the last decade. We only have the Geary Carlsen and the MVL Carlsen game, at least among very top players. So this game, the 4th game, still averages like 2790 something. So if like 2 2770s were playing it regularly, it wouldn't show up here, which means this is perhaps not a great look. What about bishop f6? We don't see any games since 2005 with bishop f6. It's not what people have tried against Carlsen. Yeah, the games are all older. So that might tell us that bishop f6 was more of the main line, or is likely to have been, while knight d5 is probably more of the main line now. Now, if we go forward a turn, bishop takes, yeah. So I think the question was probably here, is c3 or c4 the main move? Now, if you look at the database, the first instinct might be 7,000 games to 2,300. c3 must be the main move. The next thought might be, ooh, it looks like c4 scores better though. There's 5% more wins, 2% fewer losses. Maybe c4 is the main move. But if we click c3, and we look at when it's been played, we have those 2 games in 2015 and some older games. And we look at c4, ooh, we have all games from kind of the past 10, 11 years. And I think this was the position he was referring to. I'm not entirely sure. And we'd want to see more than 4 games to see if this holds up. But I believe c3 used to be played with a lot of frequency in the 80s and 90s, and c4 is played more today. And so if you just use the database and just go by the top move, you'd think, gotta prepare for c3. But if you're preparing at like the IM or GM level these days, you gotta spend more time on c4. I think this was the position he was referring to. It might have been a somewhat different line in the Sveshnikov. I was looking at some line recently, I don't remember what it actually was, but I noticed like there was a move played 40 times and a move played like 5 times. But the computer liked the move played 5 times, and when I clicked it, all the 5 times had been in like the last 5 years, and the 40 times were all from like 10, 15 years ago, as best I could tell. So I think it was fair to say the move that had been played 5 times is now known by top players, and is the best move, and is now the main line, and if you were going to play this against, top guys, that would be the move you'd expect to see. That's just something on looking at databases, not entirely relevant, because I think the first thing is that there are going to be a lot of divergences, and if you want to play an opening well, you're going to have to be good against those early divergences. And so I'm going to go through an opening that I know very little about. I'm going to try to learn some about it here and see what we can make of it, but with the idea being, if learning depth isn't the important thing, but rather learning breadth, then do we want to check like every early move? So the move I'm going to talk about is bishop d7. Just because this is a move I'm very unfamiliar with. I have some idea that there's these frequent sacks on c3 which make it tempting to me. Like, that's always fun when black can, sack the exchange in the Sicilian using the half-open c-file to weaken white's pawns and potentially get a target if white's king is over here. So that's fun. That's appealing. But other than that, I know nothing about this move. I have played the classical Sicilian a few times with knight c6, but I really don't know anything about bishop d7. So this is going to be an exploration for all of us. This is not intended to be, gospel truths about the opening. This is exploring an opening and thinking about it and thinking about why it might work. So if our goal is breadth, should what we do is flick on the Lichess database so we get a sense of what's played at the club level and just look at all these moves, because they're all played a decent amount. Bishop g5's played the most, but there's a lot of bishop c4s, a lot of bishop e3s, and the numbers drop off a bit after that, after bishop e2, but like f3, bishop d3, g3, f4, h3, these are all plausible moves. If you play this in, any decent number of games, you're going to see all of these. So the question is, do we have to start preparing a few moves for each? And I would suggest that actually what we should probably do is first get a sense of what is our desirable piece development. What's our goal here? And then we can see if white makes moves that make a clear weakness, then maybe we should diverge from that. If white puts significant effort into stopping our natural development, maybe we should diverge. Maybe the main line does not show our natural development because the main line is the main line because white puts a lot of pressure on us, and thus we are not allowed to develop as we might like, so it might be hard to figure out what our developmental scheme is. But I think our first goal should be, let's figure out what we're trying to do with the pieces, and if we do that, we'll have a better sense of which moves might allow it and which moves might not. For instance, if we look at the Najdorf, the big question in the Najdorf is, can black play e5 next turn? Because the Najdorf is often called like a high-class waiting move, and I think that's not quite right. It certainly is a useful move to have made that does not directly do something, but it can support b5. There's tons of lines where b5 is played. It controls b5, which is very important, as we'll get to in a sec. And because it controls b5, it prepares e5. Because if black was to play e5 now, and you look over here, and let's put in the master's database because this will punish it better, bishop b5 check is crushing. Because black has really weakened their dark squares. These two squares are very weak, and by trading this bishop, okay, masters tend to play this, but I've mostly faced this when I've had this position, black now gets rid of the key defender of these light squares, And if, for instance, knight takes d7, knight f5, this is already very hard to defend. The other knight might come to b5. White dominates on these light squares. If you ever successfully drive them away, and let's assume that d6 is defended, the knight might come back to e3, and then the knights control d5, which is just this critical square because it leaves d6 backwards, and is also just a wonderful outpost for white's knights. And you can see in the database, white has just scored this tremendous percentage. So one of the key things a6 does is a6 just prepares e5. Now, of course, against bishop e3, against bishop e3, black can play e6 as well as e5, but a6 explicitly does prepare e5 because it stops white from being able to force off black's bishop or force black into knight d7, in which case their bishop is still not influencing these key squares because it's blocked behind that knight. So a6 has an explicit purpose, and if you look at white's moves, a lot of them, the question is, a6, has an explicit purpose. Can black play e5? Bishop e3 does nothing to hit these light squares, and we now know these light squares are just critically important. Therefore, black can play e5. You'll see they also play e6, but black can play e5. Now, I'm going to get rid of the database for a sec so you can sort of ask yourself. They play bishop e2, can we play e5? The answer is yes. This bishop's not super active here. It's not immediately hitting these squares. It's not going to g4. So e5 is a good move here. What about bishop c? Oops. What about bishop c4? Here, white has real pressure on this diagonal, and e5 is considered a mistake. What about bishop g5? Here again, e5 is a problem because the bishop pinning the knight gives black less control of d5 than they'd normally have, and white is going to be able to use these light squares. Bishop g5 directly fights for the light squares, and black cannot play e5. Now there's other moves, but for the most part, black can play e5 against all of them. Bishop c4 and bishop g5 are two moves that play directly for control of these light squares and prevent black's e5. So if we return to bishop d7, which is what we're going to talk about, I want to think of kind of what are we trying to do, and then what moves might prevent that, and we have to figure out different things to do. Because I'm not going to have time, probably, to study like all 9 different plausible moves white can make. They can play bishop e3, they can play bishop g5, they can play f3, they can play bishop e2, they can play bishop c4, they can play g3, they can play f4. This is a lot of moves. They can probably play h3, they sometimes can play a4 in these lines. Against the Najdorf, every move under the sun has been tried. Knight b3 gets played, bishop d3, rook g1 has been played, h4 was getting played in the US championships, right? Stuff's crazy. So we're not going to be able to check every line, or at least I'm not. Maybe you have more time to spend on the opening, or are more interested in going in depth on everything. But especially at first with an opening, we're just not going to learn everything before we've gotten some practice. Once you've gotten a sense for an opening, you start playing it in blitz, you start testing it out, you start seeing positions, and then you learn, aha, here's where it's not working, I have to look specifically there, I have to get a bit more detail. But it's a slow building up, and we're not going to learn it all at once. But we can learn our standard schemes and think about where to apply them and where they might not apply. So first I'm just wondering, why bishop d7? What does this move do? Well, a lot of moves, like a6, delay committing the knight. Sometimes it goes to c6, sometimes it goes to d7. But bishop d7 doesn't really do that. I'm not sure why I'd prefer it over knight c6 for that reason, because the knight's not going to d7 with my bishop there. So it doesn't seem to be about delaying this knight. I suspect the knight is just about always going to go to c6. Is it about controlling b5? Is it like a6 in that b5 is a critical square to control? Well, maybe it does support b5, but I'm kind of skeptical of this. I don't really think it supports e5, because when we've already moved the bishop once, trading it for, say, a knight on f5, we've just given up a tempo for, as best I can tell, no real reason. We could have just left the bishop on c8. So I don't think it can really be this kind of fight for the light squares, and I don't think we're trying to play e5. Also in the Najdorf, if you look at Najdorf lines, like say bishop e3, e5, knight b3, where does this bishop go? Well, we just looked at a Najdorf line with bishop e3. The bishop goes to e6. The bishop's never going to d7 here. e6 does a really nice job controlling both these critical squares and has potential queenside attacking stuff. So I don't think this move can be about controlling the light squares. I don't think it can be preparing e5. So what's left? Well, it's a quick development of our queenside. And I do know that there are these rook c3 ideas, so I suspect we're really quickly kind of lining up the queen side. We're not in a rush to develop our king side. I still don't think we're going to play e5, but we still have the choice between e6, bishop e7, and g6, bishop g7. And that's an interesting choice to have left open, because it suggests to me that we're going to commit the queen side and then think about what we want to do with this bishop. Now that means we're probably going to take a while to get castled, which we might be a little worried about, so I'm going to be careful about that. But my current suspicion is we're probably going to follow up with knight c6, rook c8, and try to play on the queen side. From the little I know, I have a feeling, especially with knight c6 and rook c8, if we wonder where does the queen go? If we're really going for queenside stuff, where does the queen belong? Queen c7, well, we haven't played a6, so it can always be annoyed, and those moves can be annoying. Queen b6 tends to lose time to bishop e3 unless we're grabbing a pawn, and if we are, I kind of have faith that the knight or poisoned pawn is better than the bishop d7 poisoned pawn, but it might be possible. I suspect the queen's coming to a5. That's my guess, especially if we're playing a quick rook c8 and there's rook c3 in the air. Queen a5 seems a nice way to apply that pressure. But I still don't have any idea why we'd prefer this to knight c6 and then bishop d7. And that's still something to find out. So okay, now I'm going to pop open the database. I've thought a little about the move on my own. If, of course, you have a book or something that explains it, that is wonderful. I'm just trying to give away that if you don't have that kind of tool, how you might start thinking and what you might look for. And a lot of it, as you might have noticed, is knowledge by analogy, right? A lot of my explanation was based on comparing it with a6 or with knight c6, right? And without kind of analogous knowledge, it's going to be really hard to figure out different positions. So I tried, and I probably got this thoroughly wrong, but I think we're playing for the queen side. Now, let's look at actually the Lichess database. Oops, why can't I click? Because I think most of us are preparing for club level opposition. So we might consider bishop g5, bishop c4, bishop e3, bishop e2 to be the main lines. If you know much about the Sicilian, you know that bishop e3 and f3 are often very similar. They're usually combined with each other in what's called the English attack, where white's going to throw forward their queenside pawns, play queen d2, kingside pawns, play queen d2, and castle kings, queenside. So bishop e3 and f3, when I see them both in a list, I consider are likely to be very similar. Now, there are some differences. For instance, after knight c6, f3, there's moves like queen b6, trying to say your knight's not well defended and you don't have bishop e3 because I can take on b2. While against bishop e3 after knight c6, I'm not going to play queen b6. You just get free time on my queen soon. But I can play knight g4 because you didn't play f3 to control that square, and I can harass your bishop. So there are differences. They usually allow different things, but you'll notice after bishop e3, okay, knight g4 is played most in the Lichess database, but in the Masters database, okay, it's still played the most. I was going to say, but e5 is a good move there, and against f3, e5's the main move, and they're often going to transpose, but each one allows something the other doesn't. So there are definitely differences between f3 and bishop e3, but for the moment, I'm going to treat them as basically the same. I went back to the other database. Let's go back to the Lichess one. h3, I'm going to assume, is not that critical for the moment, though you'll see it's scoring a good percentage. Ooh, this is against a6. I want bishop d7. Bishop d3 is, Kuryakin's been playing it. I think Anand's thrown it out a few times in the Najdorf, not in this. But I'm not too worried about it. And you'll see black just scores an amazing percentage. Fianchetto lines tend not to be that critical. I wouldn't check them immediately. f4 might have some venom, I don't know. And these other moves are getting unlikely. So I would say these are the big four moves we're going to want to check. And I'm now going to move a little way forward, just see kind of how each of them develops naturally. I'm also going to delete all the other moves because I don't want to clutter up what I'm looking at. I think they're useful as analogies. I think it is useful to see, aha, in this other line, here's what happens. But here is different. Now I'm going to switch back to the master database because I do want to know the best replies. So there's e6 and knight c6. Now, what about against bishop c4? Here, there's e6 and knight c6. Bishop e3, knight g4, maybe knight c6. and bishop e2, e5. That seems a curious combination. Because again, why is my bishop here if I'm playing e5? Alright, let's continue a main line. We have e6 and knight c6, but e6 has been played much more. So I'm curious. We'll play e6, we'll put it in, so it's our main line. But is there something specific against knight c6 that has given black problems? So queen d2 gets played. Now I wonder if we've transposed into a classical Sicilian. Bishop d7, queen d2. Yeah. And if e6, queen d2, bishop d7, not really played here. So this suggests, I'm not sure why we would enter via this move order versus a classical Sicilian move order unless we're delaying knight c6 here. So let's say queen d2, that seems to be the main move. Can we delay knight c6? And the answer is black is playing a6 here. And the computer is giving h6 with equality. So I think both of those are worth exploring. But I get the sense here, if we're going to play knight c6 anyway here, we're going to get a classical Sicilian where we've committed to bishop d7, and that's not usually the best use of a tempo. So I like these moves that say, okay, we will play knight c6 probably, but we're in no rush to get there. We're going to try to show that we're doing something different than a classical Sicilian. So e6, queen d2, we have a6 and h6. I'm going to put an a6 as our main line. But let's check h6 first, because often if you can find kind of an early sideline that's pretty good, that's very appealing. So bishop f6 is the main line. But against bishop e3, knight g4, they cannot save this bishop due to bishop f4, e5. We're going to get to take the bishop, and probably have kind of normal Sicilian play, but with the two bishops. This looks like a pleasant position to me. They can also play bishop h4 when we have the knight takes e4 trick. This is nice to know about, because bishop d8, knight d2, and if the bishop retreats, we can take on f1. And if they take our knight, we take their bishop, and we've picked up a pawn. Yeah, so this just wins a pawn. The computer wants queen f4, when we can just retreat the knight, and we're up a pawn. Yeah. So there's a knight e4 trick against bishop h4. Against bishop e3, we have knight g4. So bishop f6, queen f6 is the only try for advantage for white. And now, if they develop normally, say so the computer is liking these knight b5 ideas. But if we take knight c6, black will play bishop e7 and get castled. That seems alright, and if black gets really scared that their king's in the middle, they could potentially castle queenside. I'm noticing the computer's playing a6 a lot, which makes some sense. Question this bishop. We're obviously fine to see them take, giving us more control over the center. But knight b5 is in the air, so it's interesting. If, for instance, castles queenside, the computer wants a6. Just make sure knight b5 doesn't happen. Li Chao has played this position. Li Chao is an interesting player. He plays a lot of offbeat Sicilians. a6, f4, knight c6. Kind of normal Sicilian, except our queen's a little odd on f6. And you'll see a lot of times queen d8 is played. It can actually be like a target here. And so actually a lot of times, it's not like we actually have this free kind of developing queen f6. We'd often be happier with it on d8 and then swinging to the queen side. I'm not sure how to evaluate that position. So h6 is an option. h6 is definitely an option. It's got some venom because bishop h4 is a mistake. Bishop e3, we get the two bishops. But bishop f6, our queen is actually a little misplaced on f6. Okay, main line, a6. Castles queenside. This looks standard. Now h6. Do we have the same tricks? Let's see. With bishop e3, knight g4 should still work, and yeah, the computer thinks it does. Bishop h4. Knight takes e4. If bishop takes d8, we still have the same thing, because when we take on d2, we still hit f1. But now the computer's liking queen f4 more. and needs us to play knight g5 to be okay. Why is knight f6, knight e4 so much worse than in the other version? Queen a5 check. Get out of the pin and then take on e4. But once they've castled queenside, if we do this a move later, right, now when they play queen f4, if we play knight f6, they can add pressure, and we don't have queen a5 check getting out of this pin because their king's no longer on e1. So here, knight f6, they can really pile on pressure. So instead, knight g5 maybe, and it's giving white a little advantage. Okay. Still about equal, and it seems like against bishop e3 or bishop h4, black is doing fine. So bishop f6, queen f6. Is this just transpose? f4, knight c6? Yeah, we're in the same line. Okay. So we have these a6, h6 ideas. It's also b5. I don't know. I'm not intuitively understanding this. So the other choice was knight c6, queen d2. Yeah, okay. So this might have been what I knew about. Okay. So we are going to be doing this weird classical Sicilian with bishop d7, probably, unless we think these a6, h6 ideas are appealing. But I mean, this position's not a lot, plus 0.5 or plus 0.4, plus 0.3. It's hopping around. You know, this is normal white advantage territory. This is a normal Sicilian. Always click X, see what the threat is. Our threat's to take on d4 and then take on f4. That's useful to know. I actually hadn't noticed that. Our queen is doing something out here on f6. But we're also likely to play rook c8. We're likely to retreat our queen and swing it queenside. Likely to play b5, b4. It's, you know, this is a normal Sicilian position. It's not particularly one to my tastes. I tend not to love the kind of Scheveningen e6, d6 pawn structures. But this is a reasonable Sicilian and a kind of offbeat one. And we have a little venom on the way. h6 is a bit tricky and white might not be used to dealing with it. I see lots of people hang bishop h4, knight e4 tricks in classical Sicilians, and I'm sure they do here too. So okay, that might be tempting. But there's also knight c6, queen d2, rook c8. Castle's queenside, yeah. And this is what I was a little familiar with, is we swap the knight, and then we can bring our queen out and try to get this quick pressure, and we've just left our king side alone. We're going for really quick queenside pressure. So knight d4, queen d4, queen a5. Not only does this support pressure on c3, but we hit the bishop on g5, which is undefended. So bishop d2 and f4 are the main moves, but I'm curious what people play at lower levels, because I think this kind of position we can get a lot, right? Bishop g5 is going to be played very frequently. If we play knight c6, they can take on f6, but you'll notice, and at the club level that happens, but like queen d2 and castle's queenside is well known as the thing to do in the rouser, which is bishop g5 against the classical. And queen d2, you know, clearly getting played more than twice as much as f4 and bishop f6 combined. I'm skeptical of f4. Is that just loosening? Yeah, queen b6 hitting d4 and b2 seems annoying to me. Queen b6, knight b3, queen e3 check. I'm just a believer in Sicilian endgames, but I could, you know, the computer's not giving it. I would think black's chances are, and if you look at the database, black's chances are pretty good here. It's interesting that it's so much better after rook c86. I would think black has reasonable chances here. I tend to like having the extra central pawn. So I don't really believe in f4. Bishop f6, we're going to take back g. Taking back e would give us this horrible, horrible pawn. gf6, queen d2. Probably rook c8, and we play similarly to what we'll see in the game. Though the computer likes knight d4, which is interesting. Let's see what masters play, because we're back in the lead chess database. Masters play knight takes d4. Knight d4, queen d4. Alright, I'm going to give the computer a little to stabilize, but queen a5 and rook c8. And we're going to get something similar to what we see in the game. I do like our bishop on d7. It just makes sure there's never an annoying check. It is appealing to me more in these lines. So okay, I'm liking knight c6, queen d2, rook c8, castles, takes d4, swing the queen to a5. What's our threat? Queen takes g5. So where do they go? Again, I want to return to the Lichess database because I'm really curious what people play at lower levels. And you'll see against all three moves, black is putting up a plus score. I'm surprised bishop e3 isn't played more. Because bishop e3 is not in the, very rarely played. Anyways, bishop takes f6. We're of course going to take back g. King b1's a normal move. Okay, king b1. Also, king b1 might respond to a threat. Like, let's say they played h3. I was wondering if we had rook c3 yet, with the idea of winning a2. Computer doesn't seem to think so. Just going to check. Going to give it a sec, because, a sack like this, it might not see the compensation. But it's looking like it doesn't work. Okay. King b1. That also avoids bishop h6 coming with tempo. Queen c5 and rook g8 are clearly two critical ideas. I like rook g8, keeping their bishop tied to g2. I like queen c5 as well, especially when they've made this capture. We have the two bishops, and two bishops are an especially big advantage in endgames. We have so many more pawns near the center than they do. So I really like the idea of queen c5. And I think it's, really telling that after queen takes c5, black is scoring, clearly over 60%. I like throwing rook g8 in as well, because I think white will usually make a move like g3. I'm not surprised to see that as the top move. And then black can play queen c5. Ooh, black can play f5 here. Okay, I was thinking black could then play queen c5, and with the queen sort of tied to f2, force that trade. f5's interesting, though. So one of the ideas is by getting the rook off this diagonal, we can make this f5 break. And if they play a move like ef5, I think it's like close to game over. Because we're just crashing through on c3. So that's really interesting. All right, we have an idea in our toolbox. One of our ideas is if they've taken on f6, we can play rook g8, both pressuring them on g2 and threatening f5 because it supports bishop g7. And bishop g7 is partially so strong because we've taken with the knight on d4. All right, I am going to make knight c6 our main line because this is appealing to me much more. Is much more what I thought this line was supposed to be. And I like queen c5 and rook g8. I think black has two moves that look like they're its least equalizing, and we have a clear plan with both. Rook g8, we're going to play f5 and keep them pinned to g2. Queen c5, we're going to move into an endgame. Probably worth seeing a few of the typical moves. I would guess a6, b5 is possible. I would think e6 is useful. Bishop g7 and f5 seems possible. Rook g8 still seems useful. Let's play out a few more computer moves. Bishop d3. Bishop g7, f5 has been played. So bishop g7. Say white just makes normal moves. Hit them with f5. The rook does a nice job supporting it. The bishop's opening into the game. I prefer black. I like having the two bishops. So okay, in this position, if they go for bishop f6, I think queen c5 and rook g8, black should feel happy. I think we've certainly equalized and maybe have more in both lines. So okay. White should probably not play bishop f6. The next most common move is f4. This defends the bishop. But with the pawn moved forward, this bishop has trouble getting back if needed, and this pawn's a bit looser, it can never be supported. So it's interesting that here is the time for rook c3. Okay. But it isn't after bishop f6, gf6. Well, I guess that makes some sense. The e4 pawn's a lot stabler. We don't have this knight potentially coming in after because we're getting rid of its defenders. Yeah, without the knight, it doesn't make sense to sack on c3 because we don't have, the knight entering the game. What did I just do? So, okay. So we're not looking to sacrifice if they play bishop f6, but if they play something like f4, rook c3 might hit hard. And interestingly, queen c3 is a mistake. I think lots of players are going to play queen c3 here. bc3 looks very risky to play. So, okay, we have two lines, queen c3 and bc3. Alright, let's look at queen c3 first. Ooh, interesting. Black isn't going for a2. Queen a2 is actually losing. I'm not instantly seeing why. Does bishop c4 trap our queen? I don't think so. There's no, like, queen c8 checkmate, because our bishop controls it. But it's, if you look over here, this is -6. So queen takes a2 has to be a -6 level mistake. So I have to assume bishop c4 does trap the queen. Bishop c4. If queen a1, king d2, so the queen has to try to hide on a4. And then if b3, queen a2. Oh no! Queen c7. Aha. Not been played, but queen c7 with queen b8. Crushing. Very interesting. Yeah. So I guess, say e6, trying to give space. Check. Here. Check. Right, the rook comes in. This is actually a fun mate. Okay, queen b8, king e7, rook d7. Have to take king because the knight's pinned. King d7, bishop b5, king e7, and checkmate. Huh. That's kind of cool. Alright, so we're not looking to take a2 if they take with the queen. That would be bad. We take c3, and we have a pawn for the exchange. Another pawn's falling. f2 is weak. Black is very active. The most common played move in the database is bishop h4. This makes sense. Bishop's hit and f2's hit. But after... yeah, just knight c3. Rook d4 is a good move because it stops knight a2, because the knight will be trapped. It can't come back to b4. But black has two bishops. Black's going to play g6, bishop g7. White has two bishops as well, but black's minor pieces are very active. The computer loves this for black. I love it too. I think after queen c3, we have a great position. So they should play bc3. e5's the move. So after queen a2, do we have an explicit problem? I assume so, but I want to learn what it is. So let's put in the main move. Queen a2, e5, yes. Because if they blast this open and can hit our knight away, they're crashing through. Very dangerous. Okay. So we play e5 because we can't allow e5. That makes sense. And the tempo works such that if they take, we have time to take back, and they don't have time to take on f6 because their queen's hit. And when they move the queen somewhere else, if it comes to b4, we obviously take it. So if it comes to somewhere like c4, we have time. We have a lot of initiative. Yeah. So it's very nice. And after king b1, knight e4 is winning. Damn! Because we're crashing through on c3, and if queen e4, we have queen b6, and we win on b2, or they have to give up the queen to stop it. That's nice. So lots of knight e4 possibilities in these openings. Alright, so e5 stops their e5. Instead, they should play queen b4 really right now. This is like the opportunity to play queen b4, because our bishop isn't on it. And we don't have a choice except taking. So again, if queen a2, I assume queen b7, and we have the whole queen b8 problem all over again. Is that correct? Yes, it is. So we have to take. We do get e4 at the end, so we've gotten a pawn for the exchange. We're hitting f2. We're no longer hitting c3. This is definitely a better version of this for white, who doesn't have the doubled pawns. Now bishop h4 makes more sense. g5. Is that what's played at the master level? Yes. Ooh, and with great success at the master level. Though not played a ton in recent times. Okay. g5. What a move. So if bishop takes, I assume knight f2. Yeah, we're going to get the exchange back there. So, and if the bishop retreats to, say, e1, we're going to take on f4 and have this massive pawn mass. So the really only move worth considering is taking. I like bishop e7, pin the pawn to the bishop. They can't really defend it. I would have guessed bishop d3 is the main move here. I'm going to guess if we go to the Lichess database it is. Yes. Bishop d3. The knight comes to c3 anyway. Because the rook now can't come to d4. The e5, the bishop's in the way. But also, in general, knight c3 cannot be met by rook d4. So the reason knight c3 isn't played immediately is just because g5 is a better way, I think, to activate the pieces. And if bishop c4, h6, and our idea is we're going to create this big pawn mass, I think. So rook hf1, it's f7, that's annoying. Gotta play bishop e6, that's a bit annoying. This pawn's still pinned. So this is a nice move for white, this bishop c4 stuff. Because if they, went bishop d3, we have this knight c3, because we are threatening to take on e2 and b4. But if they went something like, okay, rook e1 forces the action, we'd have to take on g5. But if they played like, I don't know, king b2, right? Then we're going to play h6, we're going to try to play hg5, we're going to try to play f5, and we're going to hope to run them over in the center. So I think bishop c4 is a clever move here, because after h6, rook df1, we don't have a good way to defend this. I assume rook f8, no, I'm not entirely sure why. g6, aha. Because if bishop h4, g7, right? And we can't block because of bishop f7, and they win our rook. Ah, interesting. So we have to play bishop e6. We can't get quite the same pawn mass rolling, but we do have 3 central pawns to their 0. And we have, a complicated position. We have 1 pawn for the exchange once we win g5 back, which we will. We are going to look to roll our center with d5. That also opens up on b4. We also have knight c3 in the air. I think white has played well to get here and does have an advantage, but black has, active, interesting, kind of Sicilian-y play. Alright, so that's interesting. So I think the key line here to notice is when they play queen b4, we have to take it. But we get the pawn back, as always. We get the e4 pawn for the exchange. And then this g5 move with bishop e7, with h6, looking to throw our pawns forward. Seems pretty good and active. Just wonder on knight c3, rook e1, knight a2. Ooh, they have to play d2. Yeah, because then they get rook b1, right? Yeah. So this way, they're gonna get a pawn back, and they might get another. And, okay, yeah, I believe white has a good position here. So, okay, knight c3, not so strong immediately, though it's important to remember it's there. But g5 is the big move here. And black's a bit worse. Were there any other interesting things in the line here that I want to identify? So against bishop f6, we do not go for rook c3 because we don't have knight e4 to follow. Instead, we're going to play gf6, and then we're going to either try to trade queens into what should just be a slightly better endgame, or play rook g8 and f5 with bishop g7 to follow, and look to make hay around their king. And against f4, we now can sack on c3. If they take back queen, we trade and play knight e4, and we get a better version of what happens after bc3. Now we have to prevent them playing e5. We play e5. If they take, we're delighted. We're going to get bishop a3 check, so they should play queen b4. We have to trade. We get 1 pawn for the exchange. Then we play this g5 idea, and hopefully they play bishop d3, we play knight c3, and we're fine. df1, knight a2. I guess we have to take on b4, so what happens here? Does rook b1 hit any harder here? No, because we can take on d3, and that gives us time. It's giving rook b7, but I assume most will play cd3, and we have time to defend it. Our bishops are so good, we're going to play h6, we're going to take, we're going to push f5, we're going to have great center pawns. Love that position. Okay. So this position, white, the computer's giving +1. White is better, but we do get interesting play. Alright, I did enjoy playing this line. I think this line has a lot of appeal. And I do think the a6, h6 line we looked at earlier has some too. Again, this is all me trying to figure out from the database, looking at the computer, also really focusing on trying to explain moves, not just to you, because I'm sure I'm getting most things wrong, but really more explaining them to myself. Because I think if we don't constantly verbalize stuff, you're just not going to remember it. I know I'm not. So one of my goals here is I'm not giving explanation because I think it's super useful in a sense that I'm speaking deep truths. I'm giving explanation because I'll remember very little if I don't. And I think one mistake people make with openings is they go through all this theory and they read someone else explaining it and they never explain it themselves and it doesn't really stick. And so one thing is when you hear lots of explanations, and I've tried to just keep explaining things, throwing out possible ideas, is if any of the ideas I throw out happen to be something that clicks with you, maybe it'll stick. Maybe one of my explanations doesn't at all, but another does. But another is, if any of these lines, or whatever lines you're looking at, are interesting to you, talk about them. One of the great things I had, growing up as a player, and Elizabeth Spiegel has talked about this when she talks about coaching, is if you're like a parent of a kid who's playing chess, what you should ask after a round is not kind of, did you win? Which has this binary answer and is also, there's a decent chance it has a depressing answer. But instead, like, what's the story of what happened? And I always just wanted to, like, after each game in a tournament when I was a kid, I just wanted to tell my parents the story of the game. I was so excited. Each game had such this, like, capturing narrative to it. And because of that, because I got to turn chess into stories, I got to try to explain it. And they didn't understand any of what was being said, and that didn't matter. Because the important part was speaking it out loud, and that was really useful for me. And constantly verbalizing ideas is really useful. So let's get to the third and final key move here. Bishop d2. Now, e5 made sense when they were threatening to play e5 themselves. They're not. So we don't really have to play e5. a6 to me makes some sense, just trying to push our queen side. We obviously do not have rook takes c3. I assume bishop takes c3, queen a2, and I assume that e5 happens to be crushing. Because just queen e5, because they're coming to b8. We've seen, we don't develop our king side, which means we have to be very careful. So we're not giving up on c3. They don't have threats of e5 yet because we haven't, misplaced our queen going for a2. But we have to be careful about e5 even when it doesn't look that dangerous. I suspect, so queen c5 is the main move here. This makes sense. Or queen c5 is the main move Lichess has played. I guess it's not the main move here. e5 has done very poorly. g6 is interesting. g6 says it's time to get our king side developed. That's reasonable. I do like getting our queen off this stuff, because, like, g6, is knight d5 annoying? Because if we can take on a2, maybe we can get away with it. But if we have to come back and they can take on f6 and ruin our pawn structure, I kind of don't believe in this. g6, knight d5? Okay, I can get away with taking a2. Much to my surprise. Because we threaten mate, so they don't have time to grab. Okay, so they just play king b1, though, and we still have to deal with the queen. We do have time for bishop g7. They're not going to inflict doubled pawns. Ooh, yeah, because they're going to win a7. And if we have to play queen b6, with these pawns, I don't like these endgames nearly as much. Yeah, after f3, their knight's really good at playing against our pawns. Their bishop's going to come to e3. This is going to be really annoying to defend. I think we have to play bishop c6, knight d7. This looks to me like a Sicilian gone wrong. So I'm a bit skeptical of that. Queen c5 makes a lot of sense to me, though. We get the bishop queen off the diagonal, trading queens, when we haven't ruined our pawn structure to do so. Seems beneficial. The computer likes white, though. Why? Because for some reason, rook takes c5 isn't as good as it's been. Because they just got a7. So we have to take back d. Yeah, and then we don't have the extra central pawn. So queen c5 makes a lot more sense after we've played a6 to make sure they don't have this idea. So okay, let's start with a6. King b1. Again, knight d5 can be met by queen a2 because we threaten mate. See, I learned something. We learned something. So king b1, and now queen c5. Yeah, and black has scored much better here. Queen c5, rook c5, f3, g6 looks like a reasonable way to develop. Yeah, the bishop doesn't have a lot of hope here. All right, this looks like a reasonable Sicilian to me. Bishop e3, I assume rook c8. Interesting, rook c6 has also been played. c8, bishop d4. Not clear where the light-squared bishop should go, so I like making moves that improve a different piece. Bishop g7, knight d5. Ooh, because we don't want to take because of bishop g7, so I guess we have to play e5 or knight h5. Can we avoid this? It's interesting, the computer wanted bishop e6 last turn. or at least temporarily did. It's an interesting way to try to avoid this. Okay, what about knight h5? Knight b6. A little annoying. Okay, e5. If the bishop retreats, we're just going to take on d5, and then we can play king e7 and keep everything defended. For instance, bishop c3, knight d5, rook d5, king e7, bishop b4, I assume rook c6. And we were going to double anyway, we'll evict. Yeah. Don't mind that position at all. Unless they can quickly get to the d file. So if they try, or let's say rook rook d3, we have bishop c4, so let's say rook d2. They just don't have any squares for the rook. Yeah, and our bishop needs to come out anyway. So they don't have a way to double, so I like this for black. Black is the extra central pawn, we have the c file. I like that. So they have to play knight f6. If knight b6, I assume we take on d4 and we get 2 pieces for the rook. So knight f6, bishop f6, bishop c3. Ooh, bishop e7 is interesting. Okay, bishop b7. Their bishop doesn't have its best square. Bishop b4, probably rook c6. It's interesting, bishop e6 has been played. Is that not just give a pawn? If it doesn't give a pawn, I like it. Do we have rook d8? We have rook d8. Yeah, that's sneaky. Okay. And so if white makes a waiting move, I like f5, and then the king goes to f7. I like trying to keep the king closer to the center. We're not in much danger with the king, so I want to keep it active for endgames. I would try to defend this endgame, I think. Both sides have chances. So okay, that line's tricky. This seems like one of the better things white can do. But I think so bishop d2, if you look at the master database, are we in the master database? We are. Bishop d2 is the main move here, and white does score well. 36% plus half the draws, that's another 23. White's scoring 59%, that's almost 60, that's a high percentage. White normally scores around 54%. But we have an idea, and the idea can get us to, I think, a reasonable endgame. Bishop d2, we want to play queen c5, but after they take, we don't have rook takes due to bishop e3 hitting a7. Therefore, we play a6 first as preparation for queen c5. Alright, and this is our line against bishop g5. Now, this video has gone on for how long? Almost an hour. Therefore, don't really think I have time to dive into bishop c4, bishop e3, and bishop e2. But we have an idea. We have this really quick queenside development idea. Knight c6, rook c8, rip on d4, play queen a5, we hit the bishop. If they play something like f4, we can rip on c3 and then e4. If they take on f6, we can't do that, but we can play gf6, and we can use that their queen's on d4, either by trying to trade queens with queen c5, or by playing rook g8 and a surprising f5, because bishop g7 hits hard. And if they play bishop d2, which is probably the best move, and I suspect is just not, we've seen this before, but is just not played that often at lower levels. It's not one of the, alright, we're not at the right position, but in this position, bishop d2 has been played 300 times, while bishop f6 and f4 have been played 1100 between them. And bishop d2 hasn't even scored well for white players. After either queen c5 or a6, though we do think queen c5 is an inaccurate move, and a6 should be preferred, and black has scored evenly. And that gives us a line against bishop g5, the rouser, which is the most likely move at this level. So I guess I do want to continue a little more, because I want to see, is this going to be our natural scheme of development against other lines? Are we playing knight c6, rook c8, ripping on d4, queen a5, leave the king side alone, and only figure out what to do with it later? Sometimes we played e6, sometimes we played e5, sometimes we played g6, depended on what was needed. e5 if they were threatening e5 themselves, e6 actually wasn't really played that much, and g6 if we got to an endgame and just needed the bishop on its best diagonal. Okay, bishop c4, knight c6. I should switch back to the master's database because I would like to make sure the moves are good. Knight c6, black already putting up a plus. Also a plus with e6. Bishop c4 against the classical is not so hot. Castles. And black just says, okay, I'm going to play a dragon where you are committed to something like a non-dangerous scheme of development. Bishop c4 is usually not combined with castle's kingside. Castle's kingside is usually not so dangerous. That seems very reasonable. But if we want to stick within the purview of this kind of thing, rook c8, say bishop b3. No, it looks like we should go for g6 at some point. So, okay, given that the computer thought, bishop g5, this is scary, and against bishop g5 we don't have g6 without allowing this horrible doubling of our pawns. Okay, against bishop c4 and castles, we should just say, okay, we're in a dragon. But it's a very good dragon. And just feel like, okay, here, good dragon. Hard for white to do much. I guess there might be a try in knight c6 and e5. This is often a try. But it looks like white doesn't have the compensation. Say queen e2, queen c7, then like rook e1. I assume we just conclude development. Bishop f5 is a neat move. Just say, hey, you have a weakness too. Can also play e6 to blunt the e-file. But I like bishop f5, saying it's a little tricky for you to take. And even if we don't take on c2 immediately, that it's in the air is a little annoying for them. Okay. So we can enter a dragon. I do think the knight c6 and e5 idea might be a little annoying, but we can enter a pretty good dragon. So we can't, but we don't want to do our normal scheme of development against this. Interesting. Okay, learned that. Against bishop e3, knight g4. Yeah. Normally bishop g5 is played in these lines. The bishop on d7 is a little weird, but let's follow it out just a moment. So there's always h5, knight f6, and knight e5, and I never know. The computer is varying between them. It's also queen b6. I don't know. I think it's pretty similar to a classical Sicilian. I assume we're playing knight c6 soon. This line should be okay. This is sort of weird, though, because in bishop d7 against, like, bishop c4, we said, okay, let's play a dragon. We'll play knight c6 first, but we'll go into a dragon. After bishop e3, we're saying, okay, it's a classical Sicilian. We're going to play it like an early bishop e3 classical Sicilian and chase you. And against bishop g5, we're saying, aha, I'm going to go for this, this queenside development. So we're playing three quite different Sicilians. And I think we're reaching mostly okay positions. Bishop g5 is the most testing try. And here, masters play e5, which would bring us to a fourth different type of Sicilian. e5, knight b3. The bishop must just be misplaced, though, compared to a normal one. The idea is bishop c6. Okay, so instead of e6, the knight doesn't have f5. So what if they had gone to f5? We just take or play d5 in some order, yeah. Okay, I can believe this position is pretty good for black, or at least reasonable. But bishop g5 can always be annoying with knight e4. But okay. So our idea is we don't have the bishop on e6, but we'll pretend we wanted it on c6 all along. Put a little more pressure on e4 than is usually put there. I like bishop e7. It's interesting that knight bd7 has been played so much, but I like breaking the pin. We threaten e4 again. They don't want to play f3. This is just creating weaknesses and making their bishop look silly. That kind of forces the trade. I guess we have to play bishop e7 now. So maybe the tempo isn't worth getting the two bishops. But I like getting the two bishops. I don't mind this at all. That looks fine to me. Alright, there's also knight c6. Castles. And we go for another dragon where we say you're in an inaccurate, or like a not particular, I mean, bishop e2 and castles is fine against the dragon, but it's not particularly threatening. So we get some non-threatening versions of the dragon, though against bishop e2 we also have this interesting e5 option with the bishop coming to c6, and this surprising early pressure on this pawn. Against bishop c4, we say, okay, we're now in a dragon where you're not getting the Yugoslav, you know, you're not going this way. so we've avoided the most dangerous part. Against bishop e3, we're going to play knight g4, and it's sort of like a classical Sicilian or Najdorf, where the bishop gets chased around. And against bishop g5, the equivalent of the Rouser, we're going for this very fast piece development. So I guess one last question is, why this move order? Can we do the same thing with knight c6? Why not knight c6, right? Against bishop g5, we can play bishop d7. It's the exact same position, queen d2, rook c8. Against bishop c4, what were we playing last time? We were playing a dragon. Can we go for a dragon again? No, we allow knight c6 and bc6. And this is actually very annoying because we can't take because of bishop f7 just deflecting the king to win our queen. So bishop d7 actually is useful preparation for entering the dragon here. We could also play e6 or queen b6, standard classical Sicilian moves. But bishop d7 with the idea of entering this dragon is an idea. But if you prefer playing e6 here, or I kind of like queen b6, just saying it's a little awkward to defend this knight and b2, because bishop b3 you have to be giving up a bunch of material. So knight b3 looks a little awkward with the bishop. This bishop's going to be a little loose. e6, and at some point that bishop's going to lose some time and is not really very well placed. So I think against bishop c4, we did have this dragon idea, and we could still play the same dragon idea with bishop d7 here, followed by g6. But we could also play e6 or queen b6, and those are probably a bit better. So against bishop c4, I feel the move order from the classical is probably still better. Against bishop e3, we lost the position. Black can play e5 or knight g4. Ooh, there is this bishop b5 line here, and I've played this as white, and I think it's kind of scary for black. Against bishop g5, I would say I would rather have knight c6 played than bishop d7, right? And that's the difference between this classical move order of knight c6 versus this bishop d7 move order. This, we get quicker pressure, h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, bishop g7, and unlike with bishop d7, we're already threatening to hit the knight, so they kind of have to retreat, and then we can put our bishop on a more active square like e6. So this seems a better version. But after knight g4, bishop b5, I don't want to get into it, but I think it's tricky. I would not like playing this as black. So I prefer e5 here, knight b3, and you get a kind of English attack setup, but I don't love playing those for black. Maybe I just have a bad feel for them. So actually here, I like the bishop d7 move order because there's none of that bishop g5. If bishop d7, bishop e3, knight g4, there's no bishop b5. They have to go for bishop g5 to play for anything. So okay, there's a reason. There's something I'm liking the bishop d7 move order more against. Though I think what I should just do is say knight c6, bishop e3, just go for e5 here. I think knight g4, bishop b5 is annoying, but I think e5. Yeah, knight f3 is usually played. With black's pawn on e5, this tends to be a little slower. So knight f3, bishop e7. Black just kind of makes stable moves. Very Sicilian-y. I just don't think I handle a certain type of Sicilian-y position very well, but you're seeing the computer's giving equality. So again, the classical order, probably the better move order. What was our last line? We had bishop e3, bishop c4. So bishop e2, I prefer this because black can just play e5. Wait, what? Okay, what am I saying? Against bishop g5, we play bishop d7, we go for the rook c8 thing. It doesn't matter which move order we use. Against bishop e3, I prefer the classical move order because you get the e5 option. But if you are going to play the knight g4 option, bishop d7 instead of knight c6 avoids bishop b5. But if they go for bishop g5, I prefer having played knight c6 to bishop d7. Against bishop c4, I think the classical move order is a bit better. Black has good options in queen b6 and e6 and can transpose with bishop d7 and g6, while the bishop d7 move order is kind of committed to knight c6 and g6. So black definitely gets more options this way. And I guess bishop e2 we didn't actually cover, but black can go for a dragon either way. Yeah, and here we're not committed to bishop d7. We might not want to be. So I like this whole bishop d7 idea. I think it's fun. It seems to me that black should enter it from a classical Sicilian move order. But I still like bishop g5, bishop d7, queen d2, rook c8. This looks like fun to me. Rook c8, knight takes d4, queen a5. We've seen this. I think it's fun. So I like that line against bishop g5, but I don't think we need the bishop d7 move order to get it. I think the classical Sicilian's offering more options. Which is a really lengthy spiel on an opening that I'm not familiar with, but I tried to learn it. Hopefully we learn some about it together. I'm excited to try it out in some games. But more importantly, just a little talk about, this is kind of how I go through an opening and get my first sense of it. I do a lot of searching the database. If I have any questions, I click through moves. If I'm curious, ooh, this looks like something I've seen, I look at that position, try to figure out the differences. I didn't press X a lot of show threat, but I really should have. Like, there are so many positions if we just click a random one in our main line. Rook c8, castles queenside, knight d4, queen d4, queen a5, say f4, rook c3, say queen c3, queen c3, bc3, knight e4. Like, show threat. Okay, it's knight f2. And against bishop h4, we're playing bishop c6 or g6, and we're very active. Or knight takes c3, actually. A lot of options here. We were going with knight takes c3. Let's say we played bishop c6, and we're wondering, okay, what would we do next turn? And the answer is, maybe we'd play knight c3, maybe we'd play g6 and bishop g7. And pressing the X button, or this little button in the corner, just after every move, for instance. Like, if we go to our main line again, and just after every move, click show threat. Like this turn, okay, not for them, for us. What's our idea? We're going to take on d4 and play queen a5. What do we do next turn? We take on d4. Here, show threat is obviously going to be we save the d4 knight, so we can skip this one. What's our threat here? Queen takes g5. They respond. We take. What's our threat? Bishop g7, maybe with some kind of f5 coming quickly. Or rook g8 and bishop g7. King b1. Queen c5, of course, we're trying to maybe take on d4, but maybe play rook g8 or bishop g7. So you just get a sense of, like, what are the normal moves. And a lot of times in an opening, the opponent will make good replies that don't allow the normal move. But if you've checked the show threat and you know kind of what you want to do in each position, then when you see unfamiliar moves, you'll think, aha, do they allow that move I wanted to make that maybe the main line doesn't allow? And if you've only learned, like, this narrow path along the main line, you won't have a sense of these offshoots. But if you've clicked show threat at every turn, then you'll have a sense of what you're trying to do, and why maybe the main line is the main line is because it avoids it. But when you see these weird moves, you'll know, okay, that doesn't seem to prevent my normal idea, I'm going to play that. And so even if we're following a main line out, by checking what's the threat at each move, we get a lot more breadth to our repertoire because we see so many ideas along the way, and specifically ideas that might be allowed by inferior moves from white. So show threat's a big one, using databases, looking at both what the computer says and, you know, what's played in the database. Checking both the masters and the Lichess database, because the Lichess database can give a much better sense of what people are actually going to play against you. And really trying to explain each move to yourself. Again, I'm sure a lot of my explanations were terrible. I think some of them were good. And all of them will kind of help moves stick a little better. And so I hope kind of just talking through an opening, I mean, I hope the opening was interesting in itself, but also the process of talking through an opening and figuring things out, like in the bishop d2 line, right? Bishop d2. I liked the look of queen c5, but the computer doesn't like queen c5. Masters don't like queen c5. I didn't like the look of a6 because I thought a6, b5, b4. I'm not sure I'm even getting anywhere. It feels slow. I don't see the point. But by seeing the problem with queen c5 as they take and then play bishop e3 and skewer our rook to our pawn, aha! Now a6 being the main line makes sense. Lots of thinking by analogy. You want to see as many positions as you can and have some sense of why moves happen, because it will give you much better tools to see what's happening in similar situations. I guess that's it. I really like trying to figure out new openings and feeling like I'm learning things about chess positions I'm not familiar with. Yeah. Cheers.